Morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar called An Overview of the 2023 Conservation Authority Watershed Report Cards. If you are just joining us, we will be starting in a minute. We're giving some extra time in order to ensure that everyone can connect. While you're waiting, we ask you to please take our poll. We have a few questions which are aimed at discovering who is participating in today's webinar and understanding the perspectives that you're bringing. Just scroll down to see all of the questions. Hit submit when you're done and we'll share the answers shortly. We also encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat and engage with the community attending today. Let's get started. I'm Debbie Belika from Conservation Ontario, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I've been at Conservation Ontario since 2020 in my role as the Source Water Protection Manager, and previously was the Water Quality Specialist at Kawartha Conservation for 5 years. On behalf of my colleagues today, I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar, an overview of the 2023 Conservation Authority Watershed Report Cards. Today's webinar is hosted by Conservation Ontario, which is the organization which represents 36 conservation authorities across the province. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Conservation Ontario's office in Newmarket is situated on traditional territories and treaty lands. This includes those of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations. It also includes the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee and the Métis Nation. In the spirit of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, under which many of our lands operate, we recognize our own responsibility to protect and steward the environment for future generations. Conservation Ontario and conservation authorities recognize and deeply appreciate the relationship, both past and ongoing, that Indigenous nations have with these lands and waters, and acknowledge the Indigenous practices of land stewardship which have been created and sustained these clean waters and vibrant ecosystems that benefit all of our lives. We appreciate sharing these responsibilities as land stewards, and we are committed to building new and strengthened relationships moving forward. Just before we begin our webinar, let's review the opening poll results and go over some housekeeping rules. This gives us a good snapshot of people joining from across the province. Looks like a third, looks like it's coming from Southwestern Ontario and the GTA. We've got 1% outside of Ontario, which might be new for us that we greatly appreciate. If we look at our different affiliations, glad to see strong support from conservation authorities showcasing their watershed report cards today. And glad to see that we do have some municipalities and non-government organizations, provincial and federal ministries. Great to see the consultants and students and academia represented as well. Thank you for answering that poll. So I have a few housekeeping notes for this morning. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in at their own leisure. Shortly, you'll be able to find the webinar on the Conservation Ontario's YouTube channel. All of our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on to the video. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you are not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you want to include which panelist you would like to address the question, that would help us direct it as well. You can upvote a question at any time by pressing the thumbs up on the question. We will be reviewing the questions and will pose as many as we can to our panelists later in the webinar after the presentation. Next slide, please. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat control button at the bottom of the Zoom window and select chat with panelists. This will reach the technical coordinator of the webinar. Again, please feel free to use the chat section to introduce yourself. And when you do, make sure that you're selecting all panelists and attendees. Don't forget, we also have social media and we encourage you to tweet. Make sure to tag us using @CONONT and include the hashtag Watershed Checkup 2023. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Angela Coleman, the General Manager of Conservation Ontario. Angela graduated from the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa in 2009 and was admitted to the Bar of the Province of Ontario in 2010. In addition to her work at Conservation Ontario, she teaches the Municipal Law Program for the Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers in Ontario and speaks on a variety of municipal property and governance topics to a wide range of audiences. Prior to coming to Conservation Ontario, Angela was the General Manager at the South Nation Conservation Authority. Welcome, Angela.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Deb, for the opportunity to speak to the membership and guests today regarding the launch of the Watershed report cards in 2023. And I think, I don't know if it was the music or if it's the sunny day. It certainly is a great opportunity to come together today and celebrate what I think is a really good news story for conservation authorities as well as their partners across Ontario in the successful launch of the Conservation Authority individual watershed report cards. And I think the watershed report cards, they're very, very important for not only our member municipalities and our other partners across the province, but also watershed residents, because I think now more than ever, watershed residents are concerned about the state of their local environment, and they do rely on the information that comes out from their local conservation authorities to let them know how we're doing in terms of the information that's being collected in their hometowns and the cities and the places that they live. And I think that Conservation Ontario's work, I want to really thank not only Conservation Ontario staff, but also the CA staff that you're going to be hearing from today that were part of the instrumental work in putting together the watershed report cards. I think that, in terms of positive news, it certainly is positive news that across the province, all conservation authorities were able to launch these reports and again, provide that really meaningful longer term data and trends and making sure that they collect baselines to showcase what exactly it is that we're doing in our communities and how the actions that we take, whether they're stewardship in terms of clean water programs, tree planting, and the other activities, including land acquisition and priority work that we undertake for restoration, how important those activities are to making sure that our communities stay in a way that's safe and healthy. And I think the also, the really important other thing to note is that while, there's some good news across the board in terms of our watershed report cards, we also do know at the same time that our communities do remain under, in many instances, development pressure and pressures associated from the land uses that we're all part of every day. And making sure that we recognize that now more than ever, it's very important that we not only measure the health and safety and different elements of the watersheds that we live in, but we also use that information and data that we collect to continue to do continuous improvements on our programs and our services. And we continue to make that information available to, as I mentioned, all of the partners that we work with, as well as those partners that can make the changes that are needed to make sure our communities remain the healthy, safe, and vibrant watersheds that we want to continue to call home. So with that, again, my personal thanks to all of the staff that were involved in not only the working group, but the individual work you do each and every day in your conservation authorities to make sure we can deliver products like this to the residents and those that are counting on us to do this important work. My thanks to everyone involved, and also my my genuine and sincere wish that we will continue to do this important work. We will continue to consider this work as part and parcel of the work we're doing for watershed management in the province of Ontario. And I think that we can continue to do that. These are important pieces of our core programs and services here across the board. And if you have any questions at all, I'm here not only to support this important work we do, but to continue, as I mentioned, to do the program improvements that we see that are responsive to what we're finding in the data. So thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy all of the presentations that we're going to have today. I know that I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So again, our topic today is providing an overview of the 2023 Conservation Authority Watershed Report Cards. We're going to be looking at this third collective set of Conservation Authority Watershed Report Cards. It's a project that was developed and overseen by a large number of Conservation Authority and Conservation Ontario staff. We're very excited to bring you this webinar, and we hope that you will learn a lot about the watershed report cards and even have some questions at the end. To pull together these watershed report cards, we have a very large working group comprised of members from all conservation authorities. Today, you will hear from the two co-chairs of this working group. Loveleen Clayton from Credit Valley Conservation will start us off with an overview of the process, and Ian Ockenden from the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority will speak about next steps near the end of the webinar. The Watershed Report Card Project also has a number of subgroups whose members review the current report guidelines and revise the format if required. We have a representative from each of the subgroups who will be walking you through the process and talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of doing the watershed report cards. Finally, we have a representative from the Au Bayfield Conservation Authority who will talk about their experience and how they use the report cards. We will have time again at the end for questions. Thank you to all the speakers who are participating today. We're going to start with Loveleen Clayton from the Credit Valley Conservation. It's my pleasure to introduce her. Loveleen has been at Credit Valley Conservation for 27 years. During her tenure at Credit Valley Conservation, she has worked on portfolios such as the Credit River Fisheries Management Plan, several sub-watershed studies, and the Integrated Watershed Monitoring Program. Currently, she is the manager of the Landscape Science Inventory and Monitoring Team. Welcome, Loveleen. Loveleen, I think we just have you on mute.
Thank you. I guess I'm new to this process. So thank you very much, Deb, and morning, everybody. So I'll be providing you with an overview of the watershed report cards, including why we produce them, their history, our process, and our general findings. It's not advancing. There we go. The Conservation Authority Watershed Report Cards provide a snapshot of environmental conditions in watersheds across Ontario. Each Conservation Authority produced their own brochure-style report card reporting on the same 3 resource categories or environmental metrics. Because all the conservation authorities follow the same standardized approach to reporting, Conservation Ontario was also able to produce a web-based product called StoryMap to share our collective results and themes across Ontario. I will be speaking to both the individual Conservation Authority report cards as well as the Conservation Ontario StoryMap throughout the presentation. The information in our report cards and the provincially rolled up StoryMap will be used to improve local and regional knowledge and motivate environmental action. The watershed report cards produced by each Conservation Authority generally followed this format. This includes a cover page, general info, such as what is a watershed, 1 page for each of the 3 resource categories that all conservation authorities reported on, and that you'll be hearing more about later in this presentation, an open panel for all CAs to focus on another indicator that is important to their watershed, such as increasing chlorides we're seeing in our streams and river, the importance and disappearance of our wetlands, or even ice cover. I encourage you to browse them all at www.watershedcheckup.ca. Next is a panel to highlight an important issue in a conservation authority's watershed of their choosing, a panel to focus on what actions we can take to enhance our watersheds, and then a contact page for more information. A total of 29 conservation authorities produced a report card using this common template. 6 conservation authorities did not produce a report card provided by Conservation, but provided the data to Conservation Ontario for use in their collective story map. They also provided a webpage that features information about their watershed monitoring and reporting. An example of this is the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority's new monitoring and reporting hub. So why are we producing these report cards? Well, people are learning more about climate change and feeling the impacts of it as well. It's in the news all the time, flooding, drought, both here and around the world. In 2000, we had the Watershed crisis. In 2019, the UN declared a global climate emergency. And since then, over 400 climate emergencies have been declared. So with these stories constantly swirling around in the news and social media, there's a great interest in learning more about the natural environment around them and what they can do to protect it. These report cards provide people with a simple report card format that translates the science into an easily understandable format. It helps people familiarize themselves with the conditions or issues that impact the community in which they live, work, and/or play. They also provide us with a great opportunity to showcase the value of long-term monitoring, conservation authorities, and collaboration. But mostly, it's meant to inspire action. Action to continue to protect those areas that are in good condition. Action to enhance our areas or resources to make them better. And action to restore those areas that need our help to mitigate or adapt to stressors such as climate and land use change. We couldn't pull these report cards together without the data. Data is the foundation of any informed decision. The majority of the data used in these report cards are collected by the conservation authorities themselves. However, we also have strong partnerships with external agencies such as the province. A big thank you to everybody involved. It took a few years to develop the standard reporting guidelines that all conservation authorities now use. It began with a provincially sponsored pilot project involving the Rideau Valley and Upper Thames Region Conservation Authorities in conjunction with Conservation Ontario. The original drivers were the Watershed crisis and the extensive droughts happening at that time. Using the results from those two conservation authorities, a few other conservation authorities also produced report cards, but their approaches were different from one another. So eventually, a Conservation Ontario worked with them to develop a common approach, and those conservation authorities reviewed and revised the original guidelines in 2011. These guidelines allowed all conservation authorities across Ontario to follow a standardized template and approach. This was the basis for the first set of network-wide report cards that were released in 2013, and it was decided to follow this up with a report card every 5 years. While each new release requires a review of the guidelines, they have remained quite close to the original 2011 version. The three resource categories that all CAs report on in the report cards are groundwater quality, where we report on nitrate plus nitrite, and chloride concentrations in the groundwater. We also report on surface water quality, both chemistry and benthic macroinvertebrates. For chemistry, we monitor total phosphorus in E. coli, and for benthics, we monitor those small insects, crustaceans, worms, or other creatures that live on the bottom of a stream. For forest conditions, we report on the percentage of forest cover, forest interior, and riparian cover, which is the vegetation along stream side banks. And as with any report card, this one uses a simple grading system to communicate results. This is necessary for garnering attention and encouraging landowners, agencies, and the government to protect, enhance, and restore their watersheds. Higher grades provide an opportunity to explain the value of natural resources and the need to continue to protect them, whereas lower grades demonstrate a need for restoration where possible. Both conditions encourage us to talk about how our individual and collective actions can impact the resources and health of our watershed. The indicator ranges were developed through sub-working groups that had experts from conservation authorities, as well as input from the province and others. So now I'll speak to the provincial results. And what you see on the slide is a roll-up of the average grades across Ontario. Overall, the main theme is that our watersheds are under stress. More work and resources are needed towards watershed management programs if we want to be able to adapt to stressors on our natural environment. Similar to the 2018 report cards, the individual 2023 report cards revealed lower grades in surface water quality, wetlands, and forest conditions. Most of the grades for those indicators in Southern Ontario were C's and D's, with some A's and B's in watersheds with less population, especially in the north and the east. Groundwater conditions were generally A's and B's. Again, visit watershedcheckup.ca for the story map sharing the results and common themes across Ontario. So lastly, I'd like to acknowledge all the efforts of all the different groups involved in the production of these report cards and the story map. And without each of their efforts, this product would not be the same high quality product that we can share proudly today. So first is the project management team. This Conservation Authority Watershed Report Card program is managed by Conservation Ontario, but has 2 CA staff on board as well. And these 2 Conservation Authority staff are also the working group co-chairs. This collaborative and engaged group met regularly to set timelines, coordinate the revision to the technical guidelines and templates, and had regular communication with the other groups to ensure they had what they needed. Then there is the working group. This was comprised of at least 1 member from each Conservation Authority across Ontario and some provincial advisors as well. Members of this group are typically the staff responsible for pulling together the Conservation Authority report cards together, and also technical, communication, and/or stewardship staff. This group was co-chaired by myself, Loveleen Clayton, and Ian Ockenden from the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. There are also 7 sub-working groups covering each of the 3 resource indicators of forest conditions, surface water quality, and groundwater, plus a GIS mapping and data group, a communications group, as well as the recently established trends subgroup. Each group has its own chair and members who work on revising the technical guidelines. The next part of this webinar will feature short presentations from each of the subgroups, with the exception of the trends subgroup. This group was new this year and is still in development. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction to the Watershed Report Cards, Loveleen. We'll now turn our attention to the presentations from the various Watershed Report Card sub-working groups. Our first speaker is Angela Mills, representing the Surface Water Quality sub-working group. Angela has worked with a number of conservation authorities in Southern Ontario before joining the North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority in April 2021. As the water resources specialist, she works with the flood forecast and low water programs and leads the diverse surface water and groundwater quantity and quality monitoring programs. Angela has a master's in science and a bachelor in environmental science in geography from the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks, Deb. Get my screen sharing here. You all see this now? Is it sharing the right screen?
Yes.
It is.
Excellent. So I was part of, still am part of the surface water quality subgroup. And so there are, I've got a couple things hiding my notes here. There we go. There's 3 core indicators that are used in the watershed report cards for assessing surface water quality. These are total phosphorus to reflect a key issue with nutrients, benthic macroinvertebrates, which are the small aquatic creatures without a spine that live in the bottom sediments, such as insect larvae, mollusks, and worms. They reflect overall aquatic health, and then also E. coli to reflect bacteria and waste. Each of these 3 indicators are evaluated separately and then averaged to get a sub-watershed grade. If a conservation authority does not have data for any of these indicators, grades are then calculated using the data that is available to them. To determine overall grades for a conservation authority or for the province, a weighted average is used based on sub-watershed size. These watershed indicators are based on watershed health, based on a watershed health indicator assessment from the pilot project phase of the watershed report card in 2003. No changes to the core indicators were made in preparation for the 2023 watershed report card. The grade for total phosphorus is based on the provincial water quality objective to prevent excessive plant growth in rivers. This is 0.03 milligrams per liter, and this is placed between the grades of B and C. The grade for benthic macroinvertebrates is based on family level identification of sampled individuals, and then it is scored based on their sensitivity to environmental degradation. The grades mirror established methods for family level biotic index. The grades for E. coli is based on provincial water quality guideline for recreational water quality, where 100 E. coli counts per 100 milliliters of water is placed between grades B and C. Data used for the surface water quality component of the 2023 watershed report card was collected between 2017 and 2021. Chloride is an emerging indicator of concern, and recent studies have indicated that it is increasing across the province. Since the watershed report card guidelines were being updated after the sample period had ended, and to allow time for careful consideration on the impact of adding an indicator to the overall grades, chloride was added as an optional indicator and is compared to the Canadian long-term exposure guideline for the protection of aquatic health, which is 120 milligrams per liter. Chloride data was not included in the grading for surface water quality indicators for 2023. To collect all of this data, conservation authorities have a network of sample sites, which are generally near the outlet of streams and rivers. This assesses the cumulative impact of activities on the landscape within each sub-watershed. Water chemistry sampling occurs monthly between March or April and October or November through the Provincial Water Quality Monitoring Network. Some conservation authorities have additional sample sites. Water samples are sent to a lab for analysis, including total phosphorus and chloride. Winter sampling is not available at all sites and was not historically collected. To allow for equal comparison between sites and to previous report cards, winter samples are not included. Most conservation authorities have a benthic macroinvertebrate sampling program. Samples are collected by kicking up the sediments and then catching the plume in a net. Samples are then picked to identify aquatic creatures with the aid of a microscope to identify them to family level. For example, differentiating between types of dragonflies. These sites are generally sampled once annually. Some conservation authorities do this identification in-house, and others may send the samples to a taxonomist for identification. Some conservation authorities also sample for E. coli, and the guidance is to sample monthly. These samples are also sent to a lab for analysis. The overall grade for surface water quality indicator across Ontario is C or fair. I have included here the maps for all of the grades from the conservation authorities. The findings show water quality decreases the closer a stream or river is to highly populated areas. Impacts observed are a result of various urban pressures, which can create multiple sources of discharge into our waterways, including winter salt application or stormwater runoff. Some agricultural practices could also result in contaminated runoff or sediment where best management practices are not being used. As an optional indicator, not all conservation authorities reported on the chloride data. Of those that did, most areas are below the long-term chloride exposure guidelines. The exceptions were where concentrations exceeded this guideline are near urban centers in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, Ottawa, and Sudbury areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Our next speaker is Dawn Ford, who will be representing the Groundwater Quality Sub-Working Group. After a 16-year career in environmental consulting, Dawn joined the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority in November 2002. He now manages the Hydrogeology Group and is the practice leader for hydrogeology and the lead for drinking water source protection work under the Clean Water Act. He has chaired the Conservation Authority Geosciences Committee since its inception and has provided input to watershed plans and report cards for over 20 years. Welcome, Dawn.
Thank you for the greeting, Angela. And just let me share my screen here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you can see my presentation on the screen. And as was mentioned, I was the chair or co-chair of the Groundwater Quality Indicator Group. And groundwater quality has been a part of report cards since they've been formalized. And all right, just have to get to the next slide. So why do we need a groundwater indicator? A lot of CAs may not have hydrogeologists on staff, but as was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Walkerton was a big driver in the initiation of watershed report cards, as well as the droughts. And droughts affect the aquifers as well because of increased withdrawals and lower recharge. And with respect to drinking water, close to a quarter of Ontarians rely on groundwater for their drinking water, and human activities across the province and around the world are known to have impacted groundwater quality. Ecosystems also depend on groundwater discharge. It forms a significant component of stream base flow, and where groundwater is contaminated and it's discharging into a watercourse, it can lead to chronic impacts, which can be more substantial than acute impacts from, say, spring runoff. And lastly, climate change. Again, has been mentioned in this presentation earlier. We're seeing increased chloride trends in surface water. A lot of that's due to increased winter de-icing, but we also have increased fertilizer use. With stresses on vegetation, more fertilizer is needed. And also with more frequent summer droughts, there's more utilization of the groundwater, and again, stressed vegetation can require increased nutrient loading. Excuse me. The two parameters, as have been mentioned earlier, chloride. There are several sources of chloride, including septics and de-icing. And chloride is also present naturally in the groundwater system, especially in areas where the bedrock is from a marine formation, especially marine shales. And that's an issue around the Toronto area in particular. Elevated concentrations have been identified from winter de-icing operation, whether it be from roads or parking lots. And we're now finding that a lot of it has to do with more with parking lots because they tend to receive higher dosages per square meter. And also we're dealing with chronic versus acute toxicity in aquatic systems. When I say that, organisms can tolerate more chloride for a short period of time, but if they're exposed to it 24/7, 365, it becomes a chronic issue, and they've identified a lower threshold for chronic exposure. And it's also very hard to treat for drinking water. The second parameter, call it nitrogen, if you will, nitrate and nitrite. Nitrite is not typically found in the groundwater unless nitrate is very high. Sources for this include septics, fertilizer applications, and agricultural land use. Typically, nitrate and especially nitrite are not elevated naturally in southern Ontario, but this has been an issue with eutrophication of wetlands and watercourses and water bodies, again, as was mentioned earlier. And there's also human toxicity for nitrate, something called blue baby syndrome for children or infants under the age of 6 months. They have trouble dealing with nitrate. Our adult bodies can handle it, but theirs can't. So our data sources, we have our provincial groundwater monitoring network wells. There are over 400 of those across the province, but there are other wells operated by conservation authorities or municipalities. And we've utilized as much of that information as possible. The thing to remember with groundwater, though, is that we're dealing with point source data. Unlike, say, a watershed, a surface water quality station, which represents the water quality of everything above it, the groundwater provides a more localized data point and is not necessarily representative of the watershed as a whole. So we had to figure out how to represent that reasonably. We also have limitations with respect to multi-aquifer systems, how do we deal with those? Maybe the shallow system has high nutrients or chloride, but the deeper system doesn't, or sometimes vice versa. And we're also limited by temporal data. Most of the sampling for groundwater is only done on an annual basis, as opposed to more frequent monthly or even daily, sometimes for surface waters. In terms of assessment, the chloride grades, again, like the others, range from A to F. I'll start with F. We decided and kept this from before that the Canadian Drinking Water Aesthetic Objective would be our F grade, anything above that. And then the A grade would be less than a quarter of that objective, or 62.5 milligrams per liter. And then the B to E fraction, or B to E grades would be fractions of the Canadian Drinking Water Aesthetic Objective. For nitrate, we have the Ontario Drinking Water Standard, fairly commonly adopted across the board in Canada as well, of 10 milligrams per liter as the F, or failure grade, and A being, excuse me, similar to chloride, less than a quarter of that Ontario Drinking Water Standard, or 2.5 milligrams per liter. And then the other grades, B to E, being fractions of the Ontario Drinking Water Standard. So where are we looking to in the future? We really need to bolster our data sets in terms of groundwater, look at other data sources, again, maybe more from our regional partners, maybe increasing other parameters, because obviously we're only looking at a couple. And a lot of those wells that we're utilizing currently are specifically positioned to be away from any sources of impact. So they may not be, if you will, the best indicators or, sentries of problems to come. Grading. is that linear scale we've used so far appropriate? Maybe we should look at other scales for the grading. Is our threshold too high, perhaps, or too low? And how do we handle multiple aquifers? I mentioned that earlier. It's a challenge in representing the information, and someone's deep aquifer is someone else's shallow aquifer. So it can be a challenge identifying what is shallow and what is deep, and because it's a relative feature. And water levels. We haven't talked excuse me, about those, but we have challenges, as has been mentioned earlier, with seasonal long-term variations and trends. So we're still working on those, and maybe we can incorporate those in the future. And lastly, perhaps some climate change considerations of what we can do to incorporate those into our report cards. And with that, I'll turn it back to Deborah.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I'd like to introduce Kathy Quinlan, who will be representing the Forest Conditions sub-working group. Kathy Quinlan is the terrestrial biologist with the Upper Thames Region Conservation Authority since 1998. Her work includes monitoring forest cover loss and gain, natural heritage system studies, and property naturalization plans. She has a master's in geography from the University of Waterloo and a bachelor's in science in biogeography from the University of Windsor. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Oops, not the front. Okay, great. I hopefully you can see this. So good morning. As was mentioned, I'm the chair of the Forest Conditions Working Group, and we've been meeting over the last year to verify our indicators and discuss assets and challenges to this. So first off, why measure forest conditions? Well, just like water quality, forests are a measure of watershed health. And this is an educated audience, obviously, and we know the myriad of benefits that our forests or woodlands provide, including habitat for our native plant and animals, cleaning our air and water, sequestering carbon, absorbing water, and thereby reducing flooding, cooling the land and air, and providing space for recreation, nature appreciation, hunting, and so on. So just like for surface water quality, there are 3 indicators for our forest conditions, and they are percent forest cover, percent forest interior, and percent riparian zone forested. Percent forest cover is simply the percent of a watershed that is forested or wooded. And we're talking about habitats that are at least 0.5 hectares in size. So we're not measuring urban street trees, for example. The Environment Canada's document, How Much Habitat is Enough, gave us some insight into what is what's the right amount of forest cover to have. And the guidelines suggest that we need at least 30% forest cover to sustain our native species and maintain watershed health. Now that's obviously not possible in all parts of Ontario, but it's a guideline to aim for. Percent forest interior is the percent of the watershed that is forest interior, which is the protected core 100 meters inside a woodlot that some bird species require to nest successfully, for example. So this gives an indication of how large our woodlots are out there. And the Environment Canada guideline suggests that 10% in forest interior cover is needed. And thirdly, percent riparian zone forested. This is a measure of the amount of forest cover within 30 meters of all open water courses. We know that forest near water supports a higher than average number of species, and it also protects water quality. And the Environment Canada guidelines suggest we need at least 50% riparian zone forested, plus another 25% other types of habitat to maintain water quality. So how do we do this? Forest cover is measured using geographic information systems or GIS technology and analysis. This is not a field study exercise. We use the most recent digital air photography available at the time we're producing the report cards. Now, many conservation authorities can manually map the woodland polygons on their new photography every 5 years or so when the photography comes out, but some CAs don't have the resources, and so they rely on Solaris or other provincial mapping that's not updated as often. So for grading, you don't need to concentrate on this too much, but just to give you an indication for percent forest cover, watersheds with over 35% forest cover get an A grade for that indicator, and anything less than 5% is an F grade. And I'll let you read the other columns. So what we've done is we've taken the Environment Canada guideline, say for percent forest cover, 30%, put it in the middle of the B grade. That indicates that there is room for better, but it also doesn't put it at the F grade. Now, each indicator is weighted equally to achieve the final grade. And here are the results. So you can go to the story map on the Conservation Authority website to see these maps. Overall, the average grade for forest conditions is C across the province, but that hides a lot of detail, obviously. So the maps are broken down. On the bottom left, we have the A and B grades, and you'll see those mostly occur in the northern and eastern parts of the province where there is higher forest cover, less population density, less development pressure. A lot of the province falls within the C and D grade ranges, so the central part of southern Ontario. And then some F grades were achieved in the far southwest and around the GTA along the shoreline and various small watersheds throughout. So we don't have trend analysis at this point. Some conservation authorities are able to say whether the trend in forest conditions is improving or decreasing, depending on the availability of the mapping information. I think what most conservation authorities are finding is an incremental loss in forest cover over time, even though the grades may not change. It takes a lot of change to change a grade. So in the future, we hope to provide more information on the trends as resources become available. And the pressures on our forests are from both urban and agricultural sources. Only one planet, everybody's looking to maximize land uses. Well, one thing where I do note in the Upper Thames watershed, we're finding that past tree planting efforts from the 70s and 80s are now reaping benefits, in that those young forests are now old enough to be counted as forest cover. So in some areas, we are seeing a slight increase in forest cover, which is what we want to see, and which is why, you know, tree planting is so important going forward. And finally, we do have the option on reporting on percent wetland cover. This is a standalone measure with its own grading system. This is because wooded wetlands are also part of forest cover, so we didn't want to double hit the forest conditions indicators. It also highlights the importance of wetlands for flood control, groundwater recharge, biodiversity, and so on. And it includes both evaluated and unevaluated wetlands. And not all conservation authorities have the unevaluated wetlands mapped, so not all report on wetland cover. The Environment Canada guideline is 10% of wetland cover as a minimum standard, and that would be in the B grade. And as I said, only some conservation authorities are reporting on wetland cover, so see your individual report card to see if that information is available. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Now I'd like to introduce Christopher Robinson, who will be representing the GIS Data and Mapping Subworking Group. Christopher is a GIS technologist at the Grey Sauble Conservation Authority. He has a diploma of Environmental Engineering Technology from Georgian College and has been working in the environmental field for 6 years, focusing on GIS and water resources. Welcome, Christopher.
Hi. Yeah, here, let me share my screen. All right. Cool. It looks like we can see it. Yeah, so I'm Christopher Robinson. I'm a GIS technologist at Grace Hollow Conservation Authority. I was the chair of the GIS mapping and I think data committee. I think I left that out on the PowerPoint. And yeah, I'm going to talk about what we do as the committee and kind of what GIS people do for the watershed report cards. We're kind of the glue at the end that stick it all together, which, yeah. So GIS mapping and data group, what we do, we work with other groups to collect and present the data, prepare the geodatabase or GDB. So data types, feature classes, and domains. So we set that all up so that all their data just kind of comes together. And we can present it through maps or other means, tables, charts, stuff like that. And then we also write the data chapter for the guidelines for the watershed report cards. And we make edits and stuff like that to that. My presentation is going to be really short, but yeah. So what GIS people do when it comes to watershed report cards at individual conservation authorities, depending on the conservation authority, usually we digitize the forest cover. It takes a lot of time and you burn through a lot of podcasts and audiobooks in my case, and we digitize that as well as we collect for data through the provincial data sets for wetlands, or we digitize that stuff. And then we also do all the numbers for area weighting through geoprocessing. We either set that up as a model or we do it by hand, and that takes some time. Usually once the process is set though, it's pretty quick because you just kind of run stuff through unless things have changed, depending on what the sub working groups like. You can kind of see a little diagram here. All that information goes into a database, which is the three rings. We consolidate and integrate surface water data and groundwater data into GIS as well. So we take all the information from those staff and we take that and put it into points or points features and then throw that into our geo database as well. And then we create the maps in the way that it looks. The best way to describe what GIS people do for the most part is we make maps. So we had a few updates this year. So we added a field map for people that are not using Esri products. Esri is kind of the standard across the board for GIS. So there's a few other programs like Manifold and QGIS. We use Manifold here and Q at RCA. So I kind of made a field map for shapefiles to integrate that stuff, or we made a field map for shapefiles to integrate that stuff into the geodatabase so that it all comes across in the story map for you folks to look at the end. We created some new symbology this year as well for sampling, for groundwater sampling, for overburden and bedrock, so that those are defined. We did hit a catch though that if those weren't defined, they didn't come across as proper symbology. They just weren't there because we didn't make symbology for undefined ones. So we had to do that as well near the end. Challenges. So there's a lot of challenges as GIS because we're trying to communicate with all the other committees and give them a product that they want, and sometimes that product is very hard to achieve with just like one meeting. So usually, for example, me as the chair, I attended a lot of other subgroup meetings so that we could better represent the data that they were trying to present. So I go to all those. So there's always communication misunderstandings and revisions. There's always revisions. Maps are always labeled like version 1, version 2, you're out to version 6. And that's kind of what it looks like. So we make sure the data makes sense, and we make sure that it has metadata. Metadata is super important because it tells future Christophers or future GIS or staff that what the data even means and what is collected on. Was it digitized off 2015 orthophotography, or was it digitized off 2020 or photography? And then, yeah, the overburden and bedrock classifications were kind of the little catch this year that we just needed to figure that unknown classification as well. Yeah, so that's like, again, we just kind of like take all the information, put it together, and present nice looking maps. So yeah, I hope that made sense. Again, I was pretty quick. But yeah, thanks.
That was great. Thank you very much, Christopher. Our next speaker is Jane Lewington from Conservation Ontario. Jane has worked as the Marketing and Communications Manager with Conservation Ontario for over 20 years, and specifically on the Watershed report cards since 2006. This is the last set of Watershed report cards that Jane will be working on, as she will be embarking on her next chapter of retirement, starting very shortly. Jane will be representing the communication sub-working group. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, Deb. See if I can do this as well as everybody else did. There we go. Yes, thank you very much. I was involved in the project from 2000, or I have been involved in the project since 2006. And it's one of the most worthwhile pieces of work that I've been doing here at Conservation Ontario. I've just loved it. It was our intention back in 2006 that the report cards be a communication and education tool to present scientific information in a very user-friendly way that helps to inform and engage residents, local governments, and partners. We found that they also provided us with a good opportunity to showcase the work and the value of conservation authorities. And so with these goals in mind, we had to figure out ways to communicate the science so that it actually meant something to people. It was decided that the report cards needed to reflect 3 key attributes of conservation authorities: watersheds, science, and partnerships. We also decided, in order for them to be meaningful, we needed to develop a recognizable grading system. There are a number of communication elements within the report cards that were chosen very intentionally in order to reflect these attributes and to create the user-friendly experience we were looking for. For example, the report cards all use a call-out map, such as pictured here on this slide. These maps were developed by Conservation Ontario and are used to position where the CA watershed is in Ontario. As well, we developed a set of common icons for each resource category. And you'll see that once you get into the report cards, you'll see that they use a special watershed illustration and text that explains what a watershed is. To reinforce the watershed message, the conservation authorities use their own watershed maps and local pictures to provide information relevant for residents, partner agencies, and local decision makers. The messaging itself is quite simple, with short explanation of the value of the resource category, what grade it received, and often why it's like that. And the one you see on the slide here is the Autonomy Region Conservation Authorities. And a little bit of this was mentioned by Loveleen earlier. The report cards also provide a very important opportunity to talk about the key issues in Conservation Authority watersheds. And in a lot of cases, these were climate change and the impacts of urbanization. They also showcase what the Conservation Authority is doing to address this, often in partnership. And then finally, the report cards speak directly to residents and quite often to decision makers and partners, offering them a number of specific different ways that they can enhance the watershed. As in past years, we launched the group of Conservation Authority watershed report cards in conjunction with World Water Day on March 22nd, and we did that this year. Environmental issues were already being talked about at that time, and so we felt it was a good time to use this momentum to release the report cards. To help promote them, Conservation Ontario updated the website. We implemented a social media campaign. We created a new infographic, and we developed a new story map called State of Ontario Watersheds. We actually had an original story map with the 2018 ones, but we updated it for the 2023. I was tempted to try and bring it up on the slide, but I'm way too nervous about the technology crashing, so you'll have to go visit it yourself. If you just Google State of Ontario Watersheds, you'll find it quite easily. To guide this work, a strategy and messaging was developed by the communications subgroup, and I'm a member of that group. Our chair is actually Sue Buckle from the North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority. Social media was used to kick off the event on May 22nd, and a strategy and posts were shared with CAs ahead of time, just to get everybody on the same page. They helped us to develop the messaging, and then we pulled it together into the posts. And then they also did a lot of their own promotions locally as well, on top of that. In terms of challenges, our first hurdle was figuring out how to describe a watershed, which created the need for a lot of new graphics and some specialized text. But I would have to say that the biggest challenge has been communicating the grades. People don't like to see all bad grades. It can be depressing. And we offset the bad grades with lots of information about what the Conservation Authority is doing to address the problems. The other problem with bad grades is communicating why they continue or why they don't improve despite considerable efforts. This year, we've had to explain that our current efforts are keeping conditions relatively stable, but if impacts grow, the same level of effort won't be enough. So more effort than ever before is needed to keep up. In the case of all high grades, people get complacent. This is when the CAs have to get into the details of all the work they're doing in order to maintain those grades. There are a few other challenges that we ran across around messaging, such as a lack of data or monitoring problems. And to address these, we worked together with the CAs to develop simple explanations that they could all use. Conservation Authority watershed report cards bring watersheds to life, and they engage people. They're a great education tool and are designed to spur discussion with a wide variety of audiences. The report cards translate the science and help familiarize residents and local decision makers with their watershed conditions and the issues that are impacting them. That's their value. Their local information is very, very valuable. Although these report cards don't specifically track and report on climate change, they can help to show how climate change is affecting the conditions that report cards are talking about. So this slide has a few of the lessons that we've learned over the years. So if anybody decides to get into watershed reporting, this should help you out a little bit. Keep it simple. Don't report on too many resource categories. It just gets too overwhelming for the audience who's trying to keep track of them and for the conservation authorities who would be working with them. We had to keep the work within their resources. Profile the science in a user-friendly format with good visuals. And often what the CAs will do is they will have the technical report that goes with the user-friendly report card. And so you get the best of both worlds. Tailor the messaging to the audience. We do tend to expect that it's a slightly informed audience and definitely an interested audience, but it's not that technical, the information that we provide in those report cards. We need to make the information easily accessible, so it needs to be online. And one product does not tell the whole story. It's important to complement the report cards with other products, with, as I mentioned, with maybe a technical report that has more detailed local watershed information, or with the story map that we've done that rolls it up provincially. And so that has been the secret of our success anyway. And that's all that I had to offer. Thanks very much, Deb.
Thank you very much, Jane. Our next speaker is Tim Cumming from the AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority. Tim is going to talk briefly about the experience at the AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority and how they use the watershed report cards. I'm pleased to introduce Tim, who has been a communications specialist for AuSable Bayfield Conservation since 2005. Tim's background is in journalism. He has a Bachelor of Journalism and 10 years as a print journalist. He also has a Bachelor of Education with teaching experiences in Mexico and Canada. He has been a professional communicator for almost 18 years. In addition to this year, Tim has worked on the Watershed report cards in 2007, 2013, and 2018. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Deb. And I think Mario is going to put my slides up. Thank you, Mario. And that's our first slide that we're looking at now with the, and I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and thanks for everybody joining this today. Today, I'm pleased to share one case study on communications with the public, engagement with the public with Watershed report cards. This is the approach our Conservation Authority, AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority, uses, but we're just one of many conservation authorities across Ontario, and each one has their own strategy that works for them and their audiences. Our approach is not better or worse. It's just unique and designed for our watershed and the people here. We use the standardized approach that's developed by Conservation Ontario. We also add some things that our watershed ratepayers find of value. So looking at this slide showing the cover of our watershed report card, we prepare these report cards every 5 years. Actually, Mario, you can go back to the, I'm still going to talk on the title slide, the previous slide, perfect. And I'll talk to that and I'll let you know when we're moving on to the next slide. So this is our fourth report card, and we're very strategic in the choice of the front cover photo. The first time we did a report card back in 2007, we used a scenic photo of beautiful Rock Glen Falls with a rainbow in front of it. And there is value in that kind of scenic landscape photo. But then when we went to 2013, we moved into a picture of shovels in the ground at a tree planting site. And we really wanted to emphasize that community action. And then in 2018, we had a picture of young farmers and the next generation of farmers and stewards working with staff. And we went with that approach again in 2023 with a photo showing a participating agricultural producer and some students and staff at Huron View Demonstration Farm. And we felt this was really appropriate for a watershed report card because it combines stewardship and best practices, environmental monitoring, adaptive management, and evaluation. So we can now go to the next slide, which is local public engagement. In the interest of time, I'm not going to mention all the techniques that we try to use to engage the public. Some of those methods are on the slides, and I'm happy to share this presentation. I will mention that we did share our new watershed report cards at an event with 50 community partners, and we found that very valuable to speak directly to people, answer their questions, and engage them in the findings of the watershed report card and also the actions they can take coming out of it. This map on the slide that we're looking at shows 16 local watersheds or sub-watersheds in our larger ABCA area. We focus, and when I say ABCA, I'm talking about AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority. We focus our outreach on those local sub-watershed areas. And this is because we find this is the location where people find the information of most interest, their local backyard, their local creek. So we can move to the next slide, which is sub-watershed report cards. So our watershed report card for our area, the way we do it, is created in 3 main parts. And the first part is a 100-page book, and we don't produce a lot of print copies of that. It is available as a full detailed report on our website at abca.ca. We also, as other conservation authorities do, we do a summary brochure for the entire area. And this, we have a few print copies, but it's also available at Conservation Ontario and our abca.ca website. The third set of products that we do is 4-page booklets for each of the 16 sub-watersheds. Those local reports are our best received and most used of our report card products. And we are strategic in their design. So on this slide, hopefully you can see there are 4 pages, the 4 pages of a booklet for one of the 16 sub-watersheds. And we have a thumbs up photo on the front page. So that front page, we have a big, hopefully eye-catching photo and some information thanking some local citizen champions for the work they do to protect water quality and soil health and water quality, whether it's groundwater or surface water quality, wetlands, all the environmental actions that they need to do to protect land and water, soil and habitat. And so on the second page, we have a large map, and we increase the size of that very local map because we find people really connect to their local area and find it really valuable for that local map. On the third page, we have those surface water and groundwater quality reports, the wetlands and forest conditions. And also, we also added locally overwinter vegetative cover on agricultural lands, because we think that that's one of the things we need to look at, and one of the areas where people in a working landscape, and we're one of the most agriculturally productive parts of Ontario. And so one way people can make a difference while also producing food is having year-round vegetative cover and cover crops. So that's something that we look at. And then the final page, we connect to the Great Lakes, so it's your backyard, your creek, your river, your lake, and everybody lives upstream and everyone lives downstream. So we also provided an action that you or your community or local agencies can take on that sub-watershed level. Something we did before finalizing our watershed report cards is we invited a local volunteer, a community member, and a staff person outside of our circle to review the watershed report cards. And we found that really valuable, just to have the information, making sure it was understandable, finding out what the questions and concerns that were raised by the report was before we published. And so that was something we found really valuable. So we'll move to the fourth slide, and we're getting to the end of my talk here. And this slide is on next steps. Watershed report cards are a great way to learn about the state of your watershed. Report cards are the beginning of the discussion. They're not the end of the discussion. There's much more we need to discuss one-on-one, in person with our community partners about the data that exists, and also the data that we need, that is needed. We don't have time today to speak to all the specifics of our communications outreach on watershed report cards. Some of those details are there, but I would like to say that we speak directly to local communities, municipal councils at our events, and that direct outreach and that direct interaction, speaking and listening, is really important. So next steps. Our next steps for watershed report card communication: keep our message simple, local, and relevant. Encourage people to act, ACT, actions, and those are avoid, control, and trap and treat. All the actions that people can take to protect our watershed conditions. We also need to help people to make connections. For instance, people love turtles. We find that all the time. We need to help them to understand that if they want turtles, they also need to preserve, create, and enhance habitat and wetlands. So making those connections, that's something we need to do in our communications. And we also need to explain that monitoring matters. It's so important. The data that's here, communicating the data to people, and the need for this kind of monitoring that's taking place in Ontario. We can move forward to the final slide. Slide 5 is our thank you slide. Once again, thank you for taking the time to be part of this webinar. Thanks to the organizers and hosts for having provided me and our Conservation Authority the opportunity to present on our local case study. Here again, just one of 36 approaches in Ontario. Please visit our abca website to review our report cards and visit the Conservation Ontario websites with watershed report cards. Feel free to contact me directly by email or phone if you have any questions. And I hope I've answered your questions. I hope you found our approach interesting. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tim. Our next speaker is our other co-chair of the Watershed Report Card Working Group, Ian Ockenden from the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. Ian has been working in aquatic monitoring at several conservation authorities and the private sector over his 20-year career. Now supervising the monitoring program at the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority, Ian oversees a small program that collects data to tell the story of the watershed to whomever will listen. Ian's going to bring us up to date on what's next in store with the Watershed Report Cards. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Debbie, and good morning, everyone. Let me get this loaded up. Excellent. All right. So the next step in the Watershed Report Card process after today's webinar is to, we're going to get together. We're going to have a closeout, kind of a debriefing meeting as a CA community, the folks who worked on this with the working groups, to celebrate everyone's great work, getting a successfully coordinated release of these important province-wide documents. We'll also be discussing challenges that arose while they're still top of mind for everyone. Locally, conservation authorities will begin, if they haven't already, using the Watershed Report Cards in communication with their municipalities. Just as Tim showed, these documents have life that extends far beyond just their initial release. Sorry, I said municipalities. I also meant stakeholders, residents, pretty much everybody that we always work with. Looking further ahead into 2028 report card, the working groups and the Greater Conservation Authority monitoring community want to start the planning process earlier than we have in the past. We want to take full advantage of the time that we have to do a program review. Are the watershed report cards still meeting their intended goals? Are they reaching their target audiences? We also want to tackle some audacious ideas that came up during the 23 development process. Technical, some behind the scenes type challenges that always come up when you deal with data collection, data quality, analysis. We also want to tackle, as Loveleen mentioned at the start, we also want to tackle trends over time. Statistical trends, we started a working group this year with the goal of being able to report on those trends in a statistically defensible way across all of our variables, forests, surface water, groundwater, by 2028. We also want to explore if and how other parameters can be added. Wetlands, as you heard, for example, some conservation authorities did include wetlands, but it would be good to see if we could get them rolled out across the entire province. Tackling any challenges that may exist, whether it's a lack of data, a lack of resources, just what is required for the different conservation authorities. We'd also like to see what better use we could make of technology. The story map that Conservation Ontario puts together is a great addition to the storytelling piece. It turns data into easily understandable and relatable content. But where else or how else can technology tell an important story or important stories across the province? One personal desire I have is to see if technology can help to shorten the 5-year period between report cards. Is there any chance to shorten that? That may come with some opportunities, but it also comes with a lot of challenges. So that's just an exploration or something to explore. Conservation authorities across the province collect and have collected a lot of valuable data on the state of the province's natural resources. And together as a conservation authority community, we are evaluating the best ways to analyze that data and share their stories with the people of the province. I do encourage everyone to explore the story map that was put together for the provincial picture and local watershed report cards for from the individual conservation authorities for the local perspective. So thank you very much. Oh, push the wrong direction.
Thank you so much, Ian. Now we're at time for our Q&As, and I see that we do have some questions and in our Q&A box. If you do have another question, please feel free to pop it in there. So Dawn, I think this first question is for you, if I can ask you to come on screen. Do you differentiate between geogenic and anthropogenic sources of chloride? And if so, how?
Very good question. That's why I decided to answer it live. At this point in time, the short answer is no. It's one of our audacious ideas that is to look at this more closely. There are some ways of differentiating, but they can be rather expensive through isotopic measurements. And I have done it in one case in the TRC jurisdiction. I'll just give you a very quick example. We have a shallow aquifer system there. It's deep elsewhere in our neighborhood, but it's shallow in this location. It's the well's only about say 15 meters deep, and it's high in chloride. So and it's in the heart of Toronto. So the inference is that chloride is from road salt. We did some isotopic analysis of the wells and found that it's fairly old water, so it's not recent road salt. But that sort of analysis takes effort and money that isn't readily available at the moment, especially across the province, to do it for every well. So I see us moving forward in this and using our hydrogeologic understanding of the watersheds and sources of impact to, as best we can, assess whether it might be anthropogenic or not, and perhaps eliminate those wells from the scoring because of that. But we're not quite there consistently across the province. And the second question related to that in terms of nitrate and using the 2.5 milligrams per liter, that's something we can consider moving forward in future watershed report cards. Whether we go to a lower threshold, that was one of the things I raised in terms of potential future directions. So that's, oh, excuse me, still a little bit of cough from my cold from last week. But anyway, that's something we can consider moving forward, but not necessarily at this stage in the process for this set of report cards.
Great, thanks so much, Dawn. So Kathy, I wonder if I could call on you to answer the next question or provide some insight. Can you confirm that the devastation of the ash forest in the last 2 years is not yet included in the report card?
So that's a great question. It depends where in the province you are. So what I have learned from our GIS people is when the Emerald Ash Borer went through our area 20 years ago or so, we did see some ash forests get so defoliated that they didn't appear to be forest any longer, and the category was reassigned to thicket in some cases. 20 years later, those forests have refoliated. The trees in the understory have filled out the space, and they're now fully forests again. So there was probably a blip in our last report cards, for example, maybe showing a slight decline. Again, the grades are too coarse to show this kind of change, which is why at our authority we try to report on actual hectares gained and lost, because it's hard to show that in terms of percent gain and loss. For people in eastern part of the province where the Emerald Ash Borer is more recent, you're right, that may be something that's noted more currently. So it would be something very specific. You'd have to look at your own watershed and analyze, was that a significant source of defoliation and woodland loss? Like some GIS people would still call it a woodland, even though there's some defoliation. So it's a tough question to answer, but a good one.
I'd also like to jump in on this question. For reference, the forest mapping layers available in the North Bay area, we don't have the capacity to do our mapping in-house, so we rely on the provincial layers. And the layer that we had to use that was most up to date was from the year 2000. We've been notified that the current, they're working on updating it, and they should be available in the next few months. But we haven't had updated mapping available to use for these report cards for some time. And we hope to be able to have updated values. And that would be whether it's invasive species that are a challenge, or if there's been other reasons that forests have been lost as well.
Thanks to both of you for answering that. Maybe Ian, I'll ask you if you don't mind answering the next question, which is, are you considering any new resource categories or indicators for future report cards?
All right, I can take a crack at that. We, through the report card development process this time around, the 2023 one, we had a live document that we allowed any of the staff from any of the CAs working on this to go crazy and throw wild ideas. That's why we keep using the term audacious ideas onto this report document. And we have some on there that are some resource categories that are potentially doable, some that are quite outlandish. Not saying we'd never get to them, but the biggest challenge we have with adding resource categories is making sure that ideally all 36 conservation authorities can report on it, or at least the vast majority of them can, with the other ones having the goal of eventually reporting on them. We don't want to produce a report card based on a category that one or two CAs could report on. It's just too limiting from a provincial scale. That is why on the report cards there is that what we call the fourth panel. Some CAs use that to report on wetlands this year. Some did a little bit deeper dive into road salts or other local issues. And that's an opportunity for conservation authorities to hit on issues that is that like missing resource in their area that they wanted to discuss. So no specific ones right now, other than what I mentioned in my talk about wetlands is a goal, but we'll have to see what else comes.
Thanks so much, Ian. Do you mind staying on for a moment? There was a question, do you review the report cards with your municipalities at all? I know you had mentioned that in your presentation, and it looks like Tim would also like to comment. So municipal partnerships are very important. And can you give an example of how you share the report cards?
Report cards are reviewed with our municipalities. We, at various points, for various reasons, they're reviewed, whether that's specifically a water quality issue or a local forestry or tree canopy type issue. We present them to our board, obviously, and their municipal representatives. Some municipalities, we either proactively or they actively come to us and say they would like a presentation at their council. So specifically to the elected official members of the municipality, sometimes at a staff level. So again, it depends a lot on the municipal level, municipal interest, which municipality we're talking to. And then now you magnify that from my experience to 36 other CAs across the province. And I'm sure there's a myriad of different answers that are there, but we do our best as a general statement to report on information to our municipalities and answer questions and get to the heart of their questions and fill them with as much information as we can.
Thanks so much, Ian. Tim, did you want to add on?
No, just echoing what Ian said, we present our watershed report cards to the board of directors with municipal representatives, and they take that information back to their councils. And in the past, they've been involved in providing input and feedback. They've been present at our partner appreciation evening where we launched the watershed report card this year, and so we have good dialogue with them, and then independent presentations to individual municipal councils also takes place. So certainly conversations with staff, municipal staff as well. And the thing is, these are produced every 5 years. So we do a big splash on World Water Day, and these are new and exciting, but they're products that really over the next 3 or 4 years we can use with those municipal councils, those municipal staff. And it's a resource, that information, and hopefully it also starts a discussion and forms a discussion with municipalities. So those are some of the ways we engage municipalities. And I'm sure the team I mentioned in my presentation, all the people involved in creating the watershed report card, they would all have individual interactions and could speak in more detail about that as well.
Thanks so much, Tim. Jane, if I could call on you for the next question, which is, does Conservation Ontario keep track of how many people are interacting with the story map or the Watershed Checkup website? How many people are looking at this information?
Okay, tricky question. We probably don't do this as well as we would like. Google Analytics is the tool that we would rely on for both the Watershed Checkup website. Sorry. So yeah, Google Analytics would be what we would rely on for the watershed story map and our own webpage on the Conservation Ontario website, and then plus the Watershed Checkup one. We did put out an e-bulletin when we launched the report cards, and so we're able to get a report back on those statistics to say who clicked through and who actually looked at it. But over time, Google Analytics would be what we would track. The other thing we track is if we get any requests for information or presentations. For instance, when the 2018 report cards came out, we had the Auditor General's office give us a call and do an interview with us about the report cards. And so we would track that kind of request or contact with people about the report cards, just so we can see that, see who is using them and who is asking us more questions. We did get requests from BC and other provinces for the guidelines, like they'd come across the report cards. And so that's how we track it right now.
Great, thanks so much, Jane.
Hey.
Angela Mills, can I call on you for the next question? And that's, do conservation authorities use Stream for biomonitoring of macroinvertebrates?
That's a great question. I know different conservation authorities use different methods. I've only used the kick and sweep method, and I don't know specifics about Stream, unfortunately. If any others on the call might have more information.
Thanks, Angela. I wonder if Ian had anything to add.
No, I'm actually not familiar with Stream myself either. Provincially, I think all CAs use the Ontario Standard Ontario Benthos Biomonitoring Network protocol. If Beverly wants to re-ask the question or provide us more information on stream, I just actually haven't even heard of it yet. I don't know what that is.
Beverly, feel free to type in another question, or you can send a question via email to myself or to Mario, who set up the webinar today. And we can have further conversation on that.
We can get back to it if she has an
Sounds good.
opportunity. Oh, there we
Here
go.
it is. Its stream is the sequencing the rivers for environment assessment and monitoring. Thanks, Beverly.
Oh, no, again, not familiar with it. So yeah, we don't use that. Now I'm curious to see what that is and do more research. Oops, push the wrong button.
Okay, thanks so much. Any other further questions about the watershed report card? I don't see any coming in. So maybe what I'll do is just provide some small insights from this morning's session. So this morning's webinar, we heard presentations about the history, the process, and the progression of the watershed report cards. We heard that the development of the watershed report cards would not be possible without the strong collaboration efforts with the 36 conservation authorities and our program partners. I'm going to just pop back to the Q&As, see if there's anything further. And then I'm just going to continue on. So we hope that this morning has inspired you to learn more about your local watersheds and also at the provincial level. We also hope it's inspired you to take action where you can. You can again check out individual watershed report cards at the watershedcheckup.ca website, which Nikisha has been kindly putting in the chat. In addition to the Conservation Ontario story map for the state of Ontario's watersheds at the link that Nikisha also has been including in the chat. So I'd like to give some thanks. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their work to prepare and participate on this webinar. I'd also like to thank Mario Maillet, who provided the technical support. Mario is from Allset Incorporated. I'd like to thank all of the staff from the 36 conservation authorities for their efforts and contributions on this project. And we're so looking forward to our next steps and to 2028. I would also like to thank all of you, our participants, for providing such insightful questions. It really helped with our discussions. The recording of this webinar will be distributed by email and will be posted on Conservation Ontario's website and YouTube channel. Please share this with your networks. One last thing before you leave, please give us your feedback on today's webinar by completing our short poll. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.